First session now is our keynote speaker, Simon Oxenham. Simon's Director of Resources at Southend High School for Boys and National Lead on School Finance and Efficiency of the ISBL, which is the professional body for school business leaders. He's also on a thing called Working Group 3, which gives him a huge insight into issues and developments that that are coming up. So over to you, Simon. We're hugely looking forward to this.
Great. Thank you very much for inviting me along this morning. I think actually all of the session speakers today are in fact qualified accountants. And it strikes me that accountants, you need to have two things. You need to have grey hairs in order to look distinguished and experienced, and hemorrhoids in order to look concerned. I definitely tick the box on one of those. And looking at the mugshots at the start of this morning's session, I would say I've probably got the most experience. Anyway, first things first, let's think about GDPR and unlock the slide deck. And thanks to Francesca, who's keeping up with me in the background with the slides. So what are we talking about today? So I'm going to have a little look at the brief history of the current funding crisis that we're seeing in schools, look at what we think future funding policy should be, talk about being brave when forecasting at the moment, which is really quite challenging, and just drop a few other sector updates which I think might be useful to you. I will be staying around for the question and answer session, which is about 12:15. So if there are questions, we can take them at the end of this session, or as I say, if you think of something afterwards that you want to talk about, any area of school business leadership is fine. We can do that at the 12:15 session. So pressing on. History. Quick recap. So in the late 80s, we had yuppies and the housing market crash, and we had mobile phones, which were like bricks. I'm sure many of you are too young to remember that, but trust me, they were like bricks. We then moved on, and in the early 2000s, we had the marvels, married and responsible but loaded executives, and you were really going some if you had a phone, a small little phone like is on screen now, with a headset that allows you to listen to the radio while you're on the train. Mid to late 2000s, we then had austerity and multi-year pay freezes. But now we have dinkies and kippers. So dinkies are dual income, no kids yet. And kippers are kids in parents' pockets eroding retirement savings because they can't afford to move out. So the history of funding. I'm going to go back about 10 years just to see what's gone on. So in 2012, the number of factors on the funding formulas were slashed. There was over 100 at that point, and they were slashed down considerably to about 11. In 2013, I did my first long-range forecast, and we were using at that point information from party political conferences. I don't know if you remember the thing called the Education Services Grant, the ESG. That was announced as going at the Conservative Party political conference. So it was really quite challenging doing forecasting then. 2013, the 16 to 19 rate dropped to £4,000 to bring schools in line with the colleges. And that stayed in place till September 2020, which is quite incredible when you think about it. 2014, the Institute started promoting the idea of doing long-range forecasts because you have the ESFA that look after the colleges as well as the schools. The colleges were already doing 3-year forecasts, so why shouldn't we? And we started promoting efficiency ideas. 2015, my institution and some other local schools did a postcard campaign, and we reckon we hit Nicky Morgan, who was Secretary of State at the time, David Cameron, Prime Minister, the school's MP, and constituent MPs of all the parents, with about 36,000 bright yellow postcards saying you need to do something about funding for schools. That then led on to the NFF consultation in 2016. ISBL developed the per pupil cost model of running a school, and for a stereotypical school, for 2015, we reckon the actual cost per pupil was likely to be £4,800. Later in 2016, the NFF came out with a minimum per pupil of £4,600. Already you can see we were on the back foot. 2018, SRMA pilot came out, which I was very heavily involved with. 2019, Boris Johnson announced the 5,000 minimum per pupil. And when we asked the question what modelling was done, there was no modelling for statistical outliers. We asked, well, so where did the number come from? From his leadership campaign for the Conservative Party. Moving it forward, 2023, we've now got benchmarking, view my financial insights. These things start a conversation, but they're not a silver bullet. We've got the RPA, which is a good thing. We've got DFE frameworks, which can be quite useful. We've got the school resource management self-assessment tool, which we have to do, but there is still no modelling, and we are moving towards a hard national funding formula. So keeping it going then, looking at what other people have been saying about funding over the years. So here's the PAC report from 2016-17, number 49, raised concerns over financial sustainability of schools. Report 57, concerns over capital funding and deteriorating estates. Report 21 from 21-22, concerns over sustainability and distribution. 42, concerns over cost pressures and distribution. And then Ofsted, February 20, concerns over uncertainty of funding, late announcements and cost pressures. And then the NAO report coming in June 23 that said 700,000 pupils are in schools that are unsafe or ageing, just in England. Current funding then. So we've had a decade of squeezing. And CST did a survey at the beginning of the calendar year, published results in March on the 3-year positions for schools. And that said that 20% of trusts were saying they had deficits with options, and 21% had deficits with serious concerns. So that's like a fifth of the sector are saying we are going to be in serious trouble with the way things are going. Now, I just want to highlight what it's like being at the lower end and some of the troubles that causes for those at the lower end of the spectrum, using my own institution's numbers, if that's okay. So the funding floor of 0.5% meant that I've got a £25,000 increase in my funding for this September, plus the MSAG and the TPAG. That equals 3.59% increase in my gag income versus to 8 to 10% inflation and pay rises of 6.5% and whatever the support staff is going to be when that finally lands. We know it's at the fixed 1925 at the moment, but the unions have rejected it and they're currently balloting on strike action. We're seeing suppliers putting out terms and conditions that say we announce CPI plus up to 10%. We know that exercise books just on their own have nearly doubled in the past couple of years. Support staff, that range of 9.22% to 3.88%, because the majority of school support staff will be at the lower end, your actual increase in cost is likely to be around 6-7%. Now, my school's funding is so far below the national funding formula that it's lifted by £252,000 to get to the minimum per pupil. So when you see announcements like 4% increase in deprivation, that would actually result in £8,000 for me. But I wouldn't see anything of it because it reduces the lift of the 252. So it doesn't help. If we then look at additionality, so these are things like additionals in English as an additional language, low prior attainment, deprivation, that sort of stuff. If you had a pupil that ticks every box, that can actually attract £5,275 on top of the basic entitlement. The average basic for Key Stage 3 and 4 is £5,089, and of course pupil premium makes that gap even wider. Just some numerical examples, and bear with me, particularly looking at the section on the right here. If pupil numbers were static and you had the minimum per pupil had been index linked and the post 16 had been index linked, you can see on the right hand column there how much more money we would get per year. And so this just really highlights the problem of not having index linked the minimum per pupil, which was something we called for when we got it introduced back in 2016. So current funding. With the pay announcement, of course, the funding policy unit said on average schools could afford 3.5%. Data from the DfE itself in February said that on average schools are spending 82% of their income on staff costs. And you can see the split there. 80% used to be the acceptable limit. So on average, we're already over the previous limit. Some numbers on that one. So if school A had 75% of its income being spent on staff costs and they had a 2% unfunded rise, that would require an 8% reduction in non-pay. There must be some schools that are around about that level. But equally, then if we look at school B is at 84%. so it's above average. A 2% unfunded pay rise requires a 12.5% reduction in non-pay budget. So you can see that there's an awful lot of schools that are going to be unable to afford it. And statistically, if you've got, on average, schools can afford 3.5%, more can't afford it than can. So the question then is, what happens to the below average? Teachers' pay award, 6.5%, was fully funded when it was first announced, then it went to properly funded. And if the Secretary of State thinks it is properly funded, then she must clearly also believe in Father Christmas and the Tooth Fairy. Well, let me explain. So you've got the TPAG. I haven't found anyone yet that is actually winning or even fully covering the 3%. So the initial allocation, September to March, so you have to extrapolate it to get the full year. Then the 16 to 19 rate has gone up by basic rate's gone up by 111. So you've got to add that in and compare that to the new allocation. So mine, because I've got a number of elements other than the basic with the 16 to 19 provision, comes in that I'm getting 2.92%, which is about £4,000 shortfall. So the actual teachers' pay award is making things worse. I would need another 93 FSM pupils in order to plug that little gap. And let's go back to the 2 billion, which they keep talking about. When that was announced last autumn, it was to keep teachers teaching in a safe and warm environment and to meet the calls from the sector for additional funding. There'd been an open letter to all the Conservative MPs leading up to the Conservative leadership election. And there was no mention of it funding future pay rises until April 23. Of that 2 billion, 1.45 went into the MSAG. I'm just looking again at some of my costs. So my unfunded teachers' pay rises for 22-23 were 78,000. You can see the support staff unfunded, the energy costs increase since pre-pandemic, the non-pay increase since pre-pandemic. And my MSAG for last year was 71,000, and my MSAG for this year is 171,000. You can quickly see that that's already been spent a couple of times over. So you can't then say it's also for teachers' pay rises. And interestingly, the NFER report came out, said that we would need a 16.5% pay rise to correct it, the real times loss next year on top of the 6.5% this year. So I don't think we're completely clear of strike action. And of course, just worth noting that NSUWT have reserved the right to strike with workload. 13% of schools weren't doing tutoring in 22-23. I had mentioned at the Academies show in April that a lot more schools are pulling out for this year. All of a sudden, we then get an announcement that 50% of the costs are being funded this year. We're also seeing teaching retirements getting earlier and earlier. We're seeing it down as low as 52 now. If you look at the tests, at the jobs, that gives you a fair indication of what's going on. So 24th of May, so this was 3 days before the deadline for handing in your notice, there were 11,822 teaching vacancies on the test website for September. That equates to nearly 50% of all the schools in England having a teaching vacancy for September that they hadn't been able to fill 3 days before the deadline. So there very much is a teacher recruitment crisis out there. Of course, we've still got heat gates and ventilation battles, people running around closing windows, opening windows, and having heating on and off and all the rest of it. That's all still going on. 30% contribution to SIF is pretty much unaffordable now, which makes the whole maintaining your estate a lot more challenging. One of the questions that I'd ask is it right that we have to make health and safety decisions based upon running out of cash versus the risk of a fine or prosecution? And this is a large pothole at the back of my site, which we've decided we were going to have filled because it was getting so big, because it was likely to damage someone's car or somebody was going to come off their bike or something. But just a really good example of what I mean by that. Current funding, there's the report that the BBC picked up on, that link there, which is really just saying how bad things are with the chronic underfunding of the school estates. Interestingly, the DfE, even with the rat crisis, keep putting out this blog. Proofreading might have helped because their article, their blog says schools are being designed in the rebuild program to withstand 20 and 40 degrees increase in heat. I think that would be 2 and 4. And then there's the staggering incompetence article there. That's about the Caledonian modular buildings that where they're building them off-site, and that company's gone bust. And some of those school buildings are actually having to be demolished even before they've been occupied. So RAC and GEMS, 174 schools as of this morning have got RAC. I very much want you to pay attention to this little bit because this is quite important. Look at the accounts direction and look at the model accounts, particularly the regularity statement. The guidance says it must include the following text. And this is about confirming the accounting officer signing to say that they are compliant with good estates management for schools and all aspects of health and safety. It doesn't say you can't add to it. So I've agreed with my auditors to put a comma as far as funding permits, because what that is about of blame avoidance. And that's the DfE worried about a headline which says school ceiling collapses, school blames DfE for lack of funding. And that really is the truth of it. Schools rebuilding programme, let's just have a little look at that one. 50 schools a year, and according to the DfE website, you've got 24,400 schools. Not sure why they keep talking about 22, because their website says 24,400. If you rebuild 50 a year, that would mean it would take 488 years to rebuild every school in the land. Two questions. How many schools do you know that are 488 years old and still in operation? Second question, how many school buildings do we know of that were built in the last decade, say, that were designed to last more than 50 to 75 years? If you rebuilt 100 schools a year, it would take 244 years. Jonathan Slater, you may have seen as part of the RAC crisis, said that he'd gone in and asked for 200 schools. Would that have meant 122 years? 300 schools a year, 81 years. And you can see we're starting to get a bit more realistic. But that really, really is highlighting to us how far short the capital funding actually is. Is the Secretary of State doing an effing good job? Well, there is some speculation as to whether this RAC crisis is incompetence, or in actual fact is a very, very shrewd political move, because she's so struggled to get money out of Treasury. Because if you wanted to get education funding high up on the election manifestos, you need a crisis in schools. So you light a bonfire and call it RAC. Is the PM to blame for RAC? Probably not. It's successive governments. However, he probably can't feel too smug, because it was him that took it down from 100 schools to 50 schools. Current funding, Laura Kunsberg observed that when she was doing her interview with the Ofsted Chief Inspector, Amanda Spillman, that there's lots of money and lots of praise going into the NHS. But in fact, whilst 1 million people have some kind of contact in the UK with the health service every day, there are 9 million pupils go to school every morning, and that's just in England. So I think school funding is starting to move up the agenda now. Keeping going with the current funding, politicians will say, well, the schools are getting more than ever. Yes, but what are we doing that's additional? We've got the journey to the cloud and all of the things that entails. We've got the Gatsby benchmarks, where we have to do a lot more with careers now. We've got mental health and counselling teams on site, more than we've ever had before. We're even being able to do food voucher distribution for the local authorities, which we don't get paid for. Safeguarding has become such a thing that we've probably all got a database and probably somebody looking after it for safeguarding. And of course, you've got the sustainability agenda coming through for 2025, and we look forward to seeing what that guidance is going to be like when it's due to come out in December this year. Things like we've all got defibrillators. Well, that's great, but it's another cost because we've got to maintain it, we've got to have people trained on it, etc., etc. So the more just continues to grow. And the amount of compliance that we're having to do now just continues to grow and grow and grow. So in my role, we're very much, I think, living in fear of non-compliance. What is it that we've missed? So in summary then, I think we've got very much a crumbling school system. The two big issues though, teachers' pay, linked to retention and recruitment, and then the long-term financial viability of schools. So what do we think needs to be the future for funding policy? Sufficiency, future confidence, and capital. Quite simple, just three things. Let's dig into that a little bit. Sufficiency. People say we don't have a choice. So the G7, looking at the percentage of GDP that they've spent on education, Canada, 5.5, France, USA, Germany, United Kingdom down at 3.9, then Italy and Japan. So we're quite low down. Well, the average is 4.6%. To give you what that might look like in real numbers, if we had 4.6% compared to 3.9, from my school, that would be an additional £1.4 million of operating income. Life would be a whole lot easier. That's all data you can get from Wikipedia. So let's have a look at some other comparisons going in that vein. You can see them popping up on the screen now, right the way down to Norway at 8%. So UK is actually 3.9%, is 114th out of 192 countries with published data. And this is from 1989 right through to 2019. So quite a significant period of time. So an average of 5%, that would give me a £2.2 million of operating income extra. So clearly we do have a choice. So what we're suggesting is that you should be aiming to be at 5% of GDP / the top third. Now, when you think that other countries like Ethiopia are putting in significantly more than we are, Houston, we have a problem. Future confidence. We've been in the squeeze for 10 years. It's been going on for long enough. And eventually you get to the point where you're not just cutting the fat, you're cutting into the bone. And I don't know about you, but I spend vast amounts of time talking about funding and finances with senior leadership team and with the trust board. We really want a clear funding policy for future generations, for both mainstream schools and for special schools. So the quite simple answer is we need to find a way to lock it in, i.e. lock it into CPI, link it to CPI. Capital. We need to recognise that pupil environments that they're in influences their outcomes. Their behaviour is influenced by the environment as well. And the risk of failure, as we've seen with RAC, is very much growing in the school estate at the moment. And we think the pupils deserve better. The quote that I came up with, the evidence is clear, the school estate is not funded adequately, and the upfront cost to fixing it is growing to be a seismic problem that we seem to be content to inflict upon the next generation. My fear is what they might inflict upon us when they realise we're in a care home. Now, if you think I'm being a bit glib, my daughter is in one of the schools that's closed because of RAC, and her school was closed at the end of May half term, and currently we're looking at possibly November to get some demountables. So for capital, we think 25/75. There should be sufficient capital that you can refurbish a classroom every 25 years. I think you need to have sufficient capital to rebuild a school every 75 years. Because as you think about it, how old your school buildings are, probably at 75 years, they'll be done. So, forecasting in turbulent times or being brave. Some things to ask yourselves. Pupil outcomes should be number one in every decision that you make. So can you demonstrate that you're as efficient as you can be? Have you explored every option? Are you forecast based on realistic assumptions? Do you have a predicted outturn so you know where you're going in the current year? Are all your decisions defensible? If every kid has got an iPad and you haven't got enough money to buy Pritt sticks, that's possibly an undefensible decision, for example. Have you had an SRMA visit? I had one last year that we were invited to take, so we said yes, and I called in the godfather of SRMAs, Mr. Andy Hamilton, and that was highly entertaining. Are your parents ready to be supportive? Have you got your MP rode up? If you can answer yes to all of those questions, then I think you need to start thinking about protecting your provision and being brave. And being brave means contacting the ESFA and engaging with them. Just something to point out that when they first started doing long-range forecasts, the BFR, the sector had pessimism bias as far as the IFE were concerned. And what that meant was that everybody was putting in their forecast saying we're heading over the hill, but nobody ever did. Now we're seeing optimism bias with people saying there it will be fine in their forecast in order to avoid one of those pesky SRMA visits. Be sensible. Be realistic is my advice, please. Something else to be aware of, and apologies for slight merchant of gloom here, pupil numbers. This is from the IFS. They are saying that pupil numbers are going to be falling. There's the sectors, and there's the more regional distribution. So it's particularly in the northeast, southeast London that are going to be affected. DfE guidance on what to do is there. Talking to people, there are lots of trusts that can't make 23-24 work. There are lots more that can't make next year work. So if you've answered yes to all those questions on the previous slide, then think about being brave. Don't accept that it's a failure of the board, poor management, if it is actually a failure of national funding policy. Just remember, pupil outcomes must be the priority in all the decisions. This is the web page for the 40 million hardship fund that was announced with the teachers' pay. As you can see, that's particularly helpful at the moment. Now, I don't know what being brave looks like for you. I can tell you that today I am talking to you from my room in Westminster. Sanctuary Buildings is next door. And after I finish with you, good folk, today, I'm going to go and have an entertaining meeting with the schools minister, talking about the financial plight of my institution and of the sector. So being brave, worst case scenario, head teacher / CEO gets suspended and you get an interim board put in place. But remember the Daily Mail test. Officials live by the Daily Mail test, i.e. avoiding being the next headline. Better case scenario, you get additional funding. But just consider any conditions if they drop those on you. Best case scenario, if we all stand up and be brave and say, we can't make this work, we've got to have more funding, the whole sector gets additional funding. This is just as an example now on screen of how I model options for meetings, various scenarios. You can move those sliders around and change things. How do I do that? The instructions are on the next slide. It's native Excel. That's a free takeaway for you. One of the things, though, to be aware of when you do engage with officials and ministers is the unpalatable decision tension. And what I mean by that is that ministers will say things like, in secondary schools, you should have 3 foreign languages, you should have a library, but junior officials will be saying, well, if you need to close the library and reduce your curriculum, then that's what you need to do. Again, think about pupil outcomes and what's best for the pupils and stand your ground. Are MATs the answer? I don't think so. What we're seeing is that MATs are moving money around within their schools in order to avoid deficits. There's still no evidence that the economies of being part of a MAT outweigh the diseconomies. I think you've got the FE pay cap that's come in. I can only but think that they're going to bring that some way into the academy sector. With the FE pay cap, anyone that you want to pay more than £150,000 to, you have to get ministerial written permission and allow 2 months to get that. So I think there's going to be lots of reasons why MATs are going to struggle. Other bits of information, DfE did a survey of head teachers back in June. They are going to publish that information. We've managed to track the author down later this autumn. There's a reserves guide coming out. Treasury is still very much fixated on them. Suggested numbers could be 5% would be the lowest, 20% of operating income being the highest for your reserves. Board diversity, most have avoided that because of the legal implications, but you should publish those. SIF outcomes, was the feedback correct? And watch out for fire doors. Lots of fire risk assessors saying you need a specialist fire door survey. The fire door survey is done by companies that supply fire doors. Fire doors, relatively low risk with schools because you're going to be out of the building in about 3 to 4 minutes, and most aren't residential. Why spend money on fire doors if you don't really need to? Handbook simplification or complication. ICFP is now in as encouraged. ICT, the DfE ICT standards are likely to go in, we're told. Sustainability, that will probably go into the handbook in the future. But the notice to improves, they are still trying to be more carrot and less stick at the moment. Internal audit, I can see that as an area that's going to continue to grow. There's an updated good practice guide coming. Sustainability, I think you'll end up having that audited. That's the same with ICT, ICFP, health and safety, probably already getting audited, and GEMS. And think about how you combine a summary report, whether you want to perhaps get your internal auditor to take, say, your health and safety auditor's report and combine them to the summary rather than getting a committee to do it. So in conclusion then, as I bring it into land, be brave, produce realistic forecasts, be ready to prove efficiency and protect the provision. Be ready, think about election manifestos, how we might influence those. Think about the 3 pillars, the sufficiency, the future, confidence and the capital, and be ready for the more. And be committed to standing up for yourselves and the pupils that we represent. So, with a cooked breakfast, they say that the chicken participates, the chef is involved, but the pig is committed. How committed are you this morning? Finally, the event organisers asked me just to say that they would very much welcome feedback on all the sessions this morning, both negative and positive. If you have any negative feedback about this session, then my name's Gillian Keegan, Secretary of State for Education. Thank you very much. Good luck.
Well done, Simon. Thank you very much. That's an effing good job you've done there, undoubtedly. Can I ask you a question? What happens after the next election?
So what we are been quietly working on in the background is the possibility of doing a national funding campaign with inviting all schools and trusts to participate, because we need to get education funding high up on the election manifesto. We think RAC has helped, but we think we can do more to get that high up. And what we want to do is approach all political parties, all party political candidates, to get them all focused on it, so that they then start bidding as to how much that they're going to put, how much they would invest, because that's really the only way to do it, we think. Because
You've
as you've
answered
seen
a
from the numbers
better
I've shared with you,
question than I
it's
asked.
just not
Yeah, what should we do? Yeah, what should we do before the election rather than what should happen afterwards? Absolutely. Thank you very much.
So
yeah,
I'm hoping that we've already spoken. We've got one of the big unions involved, two of the big unions involved, and the institute. So there's a couple of others we need to have conversations with, and then we're thinking about something a bit like the postcard campaign, but doing it on a national scale. So watch this space.